May 3, 1926, 1 minute to midnight. I want you to place yourself right in the middle of this scene.
Yeah.
You are standing in the massive, just deafening printing room of the Daily Mail in London.
Right.
And the smell of heavy lead and industrial ink is just, it's thick in the air.
Right.
This is essentially the nervous system of the British Empire's media apparatus.
Right.
But the massive rotary presses, which, they should be roaring right now to churn out the morning edition for millions of readers, they are completely silent.
Wow.
Yeah, the printers have stopped working. They're just standing there, ink-stained, defiant, right in their work clothes, flatly refusing to set the type for a very specific editorial. And this editorial is this vicious, calculated condemnation of an impending general strike.
Right. Calling it a threat to the nation.
Exactly. The text they refuse to print calls the strike a revolutionary move, which can only succeed by destroying the government and subverting the rights and liberties of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And the workers read those words, and they simply refuse to be the instruments of their own class's denunciation. They fold their arms. The presses stay cold.
That is such a powerful image.
It really is. And word of this hyper-localized, spontaneous work stoppage immediately reaches the conservative prime minister, Stanley Baldwin. And Baldwin, he doesn't see a localized crisis to be managed. He sees the golden opportunity he has been waiting for.
Yeah, his excuse.
Right. He uses this action by the printers as the ultimate, irrevocable excuse to completely break off all ongoing negotiations with the Trades Union Congress, the TUC. Baldwin looks across the table at the leaders of the British labor movement and issues this definitive, chilling declaration. He just says, "This is the end." And within mere hours of that statement, the greatest display of organized working-class power in British history actually begins. 4 million workers walk out. They shut down the very core of the empire. I mean, transport, heavy industry, communications, everything just stops.
It's just staggering. And, to set the stage for our listeners today, our goal in this deep dive isn't to litigate which political faction was right or wrong in these massive historical debates of the 20th century.
Right. We're not taking sides here.
Exactly. Our mission is to look directly at the primary texts, specifically the writings of the left opposition, of Leon Trotsky, and the official directives of Joseph Stalin and the Comintern. We're putting ourselves inside the theoretical debates of 1920s Moscow to see exactly how those theories collided with reality on the ground.
Because we are examining these historical events exactly as they are presented in the source texts themselves.
Right. Because the core question this deep dive takes up is really profound. What were the devastating real-world consequences of Joseph Stalin's theory of socialism in one country when it was actually tested in practice? And we are going to examine how this theory operated not in the abstract, but, right there in the industrial heartland of Britain, and then even more violently in the revolutionary crucible of China.
Yeah, from London to Shanghai.
Exactly. We are looking at a period where the intense theoretical struggles taking place in the halls of the Kremlin cease to be matters of semantic debate. They become literal matters of life and death on the streets. The defiant printers you just described provided the immediate spark, sure, but the powder keg of 1926 had been systematically filled by profound international class forces, and it was navigated using some deeply flawed theoretical frameworks.
And to understand the sheer scale of that powder keg, you really have to look closely at what Britain actually was in the 1920s. On paper, obviously, this is a nation that emerged victorious from the First World War. They have the empire, the monarchy, the global prestige.
Right, the map is still painted pink.
Yeah, exactly. But functionally, fundamentally, Britain is a declining imperial power. The economic reality is incredibly grim. You have this relentless, massive squeeze being applied by a rising American capitalism on British industry, British trade, and British finance. The old global equilibrium is just breaking down entirely.
And that tension has to go somewhere.
It does. And the absolute center, the bleeding edge of this economic storm is the British coal industry. Coal was the engine of the empire. But the mine owners in the 1920s are facing plummeting global export markets. They're sitting on outdated, underinvested infrastructure. And their conclusion is that the only way to remain profitable is to launch a brutal frontal assault on the miners themselves.
Taking it out on the workers.
Right. They demand savage wage cuts. They demand a longer working day. They are attempting to squeeze their profit margins directly out of the very survival of the working class. And this tension builds month after month until it reaches a breaking point on July 31st, 1925.
Red Friday.
Exactly. A day that goes down in labor history as Red Friday. Facing the absolute certainty of a massive, crippling strike by the miners and the transport workers, the conservative government steps in at the 11th hour. They grant a temporary 9-month financial subsidy to the coal industry to maintain the miners' current wages.
And everyone cheered, right?
Oh, yeah. A massive portion of the British labor movement celebrated this as a monumental victory. They threw their hats in the air. But, and this is crucial, if you look closely at the actual mechanics of what the state was doing, it wasn't a victory for the workers at all.
No, it was a tactical retreat.
Think of it like a modern, ruthless corporation that has secretly planned to execute massive, brutal layoffs across all its divisions. But the executives realize that right now, in this moment, the workers are too angry, they're too organized, and the company's private security just isn't ready yet.
Right.
So the executives offer a tiny, temporary holiday bonus. They do it just to delay the strike. They buy themselves just enough time to hire a private mercenary security force, install biometric locks on the doors, and legally prepare the termination papers.
That is exactly what the British state did on Red Friday.
Point for point.
Yeah.
They bought themselves exactly 9 months. And over those 9 months, the government made systematic, ruthless preparations for a general, class-wide conflict. They established the Organization for the Maintenance of Supplies, the OMS.
Which was basically a state-sponsored strike-breaking network.
Yeah, sprawling all over the country. Designed to recruit and train upper-class and middle-class people to run the trains and drive the trucks when the time came. They also passed the Emergency Powers Act, granting the state sweeping, dictatorial control over resources and the police.
Preparing for civil war, basically.
And they didn't just prepare legally and logistically. They struck preemptively. In October 1925, armed police launched coordinated raids on the headquarters of the Communist Party of Great Britain, the CPGB. 12 of its top leaders were dragged into court, subjected to a show trial, convicted of sedition, and thrown into prison cells.
Just clearing the board.
Exactly. Locked away months before the general strike even began. The state was removing anyone who might provide actual revolutionary direction.
And you know, while the British state was methodically preparing for domestic war, a profound theoretical battle over how the international working class should respond was taking place thousands of miles away in the Soviet Union.
Right, in Moscow.
Well, actually, in the winter and spring of 1925, Leon Trotsky was convalescing from an illness in the Caucasus. But he was watching Britain closely, and he produced a deeply analytical, highly predictive book called Where is Britain Going?
Okay.
And in this text, Trotsky completely dismissed the prevailing notion that the British crisis was merely a local trade dispute over shillings and pence. He looked at the underlying tectonic plates of the global economy. He accurately predicted the rapid approach of a general strike and argued that the strike would inevitably pose the question of power in society, creating a revolutionary crisis.
He saw the writing on the wall.
He did.
Yeah.
He identified the true engine driving the British working class toward this cliff. Let me read his exact words from the source. Trotsky wrote, "If culprits are to be sought, then in answer to the question who and what are propelling Britain along the road to revolution, we must say, not Moscow, but New York." That was the reality. The objective economic dominance of the United States was ruthlessly forcing the British ruling class to attack its own working class, making a massive collision absolutely inevitable. It had nothing to do with Russian agitators. It was the mechanical necessity of British capitalism trying to survive American pressure.
Okay, but how did Stalin and the Comintern view this?
Well, Joseph Stalin, along with Nikolai Bukharin and Grigory Zinoviev, who were leading the Comintern at the time, had a fundamentally different reading of the situation, and consequently, a fundamentally different policy. Their policy in Britain was the direct, practical application of the theory of socialism in one country.
Meaning what exactly in this context?
The logic was simple. If the world revolution was no longer on the immediate horizon, the primary duty of the Soviet leadership was not to encourage revolutionary upheavals abroad that might provoke capitalist intervention, but rather to secure diplomatic and trade stability for the Soviet Union.
Prioritize the state over the international revolution.
Exactly. And their chosen vehicle for securing this diplomatic stability in Britain was a formalized structure known as the Anglo-Russian Committee. This was an official, highly publicized alliance formed in 1925 between the Soviet trade unions and the General Council of the British Trades Union Congress.
The TUC.
Right. Stalin's faction argued that the supposedly left trade union leaders in Britain, men like A.A. Purcell, George Hicks, and A.J. Cook, who, they frequently used radical, even quasi-Marxist rhetoric in their speeches. Stalin argued these guys could be drawn gradually and peacefully into the communist orbit. He believed the Soviet Union could navigate the explosive British crisis by leaning on these established Union bureaucrats, thereby avoiding a direct, messy, and diplomatically dangerous struggle.
Hold on, I have to stop you there.
Yeah.
Because I want to look at this from the perspective of someone actually sitting in Moscow in 1925, looking at the map of Europe.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have the Communist Party of Great Britain, which is a tiny, highly marginalized, very new radical group. On the other hand, you have the Trades Union Congress, this absolute behemoth of an organization that commands the institutional loyalty of millions of British workers.
Millions, yeah.
Doesn't it make perfect, undeniable strategic sense to ally with the big guys? I mean, if you want to influence the British working class, why wouldn't you link arms with the established leaders who already have the massive platforms, rather than isolating your tiny radical party by constantly attacking the very people the workers currently trust?
It's a fair question, and that is precisely the pragmatic, common-sense argument that Stalin and his supporters advanced. But Trotsky countered it by returning to the core foundational lessons of the 1917 Russian Revolution.
Okay.
In his earlier work, Lessons of October, Trotsky had painstakingly explained that the fundamental task of a revolutionary vanguard party is not to tail behind bureaucratic leaders in the name of numbers, but to mercilessly expose those leaders to the masses.
Expose them.
Yes. The union bureaucrats, especially the ones who employ fiery left-wing rhetoric, are fundamentally tied to the preservation of the capitalist system. Their entire social position, their respectability, their negotiating power, depends on the maintenance of the existing order.
Ah, I see.
They use radical phrases not to incite revolution, but to act as a pressure valve, venting the anger of the workers while actively preventing them from taking independent political action. Trotsky summarized the absolute futility of relying on these reformist leaders with absolute precision. He wrote, "It has never yet been possible to cross a revolutionary stream on the horse of reformism, and a class which enters battle under opportunist leaders is compelled to change them under the enemy's fire."
Man.
That was the warning. The horse will always drown the rider. You cannot cross the stream of a general strike which inherently challenges the capitalist state on a leadership that is fundamentally loyal to that state.
Right, because when push comes to shove, they'll side with the state.
Exactly. Furthermore, Trotsky provided a brilliant, devastating critique of the psychological underpinnings of Stalin's policy. He noted that the growing Soviet bureaucracy was exhausted by the demands of revolution. They sought to replace the arduous, historically necessary task of building a small, fiercely independent communist party with a much easier search for a broader current headed by what Trotsky called fine fellows and good acquaintances.
Fine fellows. That's so revealing.
It is. The Soviet bureaucrats wanted solid, respectable, predictable British leaders they could negotiate treaties with, rather than a volatile, demanding revolutionary party that might actually disrupt their delicate diplomatic arrangements with London. This obsessive search for fine fellows within the trade union bureaucracy inherently meant demanding that the British Communist Party abandon the political independence of the working class.
And the results of this search for diplomatic fine fellows were incredibly stark. When you look at the directives coming out of Moscow, Stalin's mindset at this time perfectly, almost tragically, encapsulates the diplomatic logic of socialism in one country.
Oh, absolutely. Stalin laid this logic out quite plainly, with an astonishing lack of revolutionary urgency, in February 1926. Discussing the international situation and the prospects for revolution, he stated, "While as the victory of the revolution in the West is rather late in coming, nothing remains for us to do, apparently, but to loaf around."
Just loaf around.
That was the posture. The complacency of that statement is staggering. Here you have a massive, unprecedented class conflict brewing in Britain, the most powerful empire on Earth, and the leader of the Soviet apparatus speaks of loafing around, simply waiting for history to eventually deliver a better hand.
It's unbelievable.
Because the immediate overriding priority was the diplomatic security of the Soviet state, secured via the alliance of the Anglo-Russian Committee, the resulting Comintern orders handed down to the British Communist Party were utterly devastating.
What did they tell them to do?
The CPGB cadres were explicitly instructed to subordinate themselves entirely to the leadership of the Trades Union Congress. They were told to abandon any sharp, clarifying criticism of the union leaders, even as those leaders were clearly preparing to capitulate. The central guiding slogan they were ordered to adopt and propagate among the workers was, "All power to the General Council."
Wow. They were effectively liquidating their own political independence, telling the workers to trust the very bureaucrats who were about to betray them, right as the greatest class battle in British history was about to commence.
Exactly.
And the psychological impact of those orders from Moscow on the actual members of the British Communist Party leadership is painful to observe. You can see the revolutionary fighting spirit draining out of them in real time. Look at the statements being published just days before the strike.
Yeah, J.T. Murphy's statement is particularly tragic.
Right. 3 days before the general strike erupted, J.T. Murphy, a highly prominent leader of the CPGB, published this perfectly fatalistic, deeply depressing statement in the Workers' Weekly. He had completely, totally internalized this subordinate role dictated by Moscow.
It's a devastating admission of political surrender. Murphy wrote, "Our party does not hold the leading positions. To entertain any exaggerated views as to the revolutionary possibilities is fantastic."
Yes.
The tragedy is immense. The vanguard party formally announced its own irrelevance. They looked at the millions of workers who were about to risk their livelihoods in a massive strike against the state, and they told them that any hope for a revolutionary outcome, any hope for actually changing society, was a mere fantasy.
Which effectively endorses the conservative, timid leadership of the TUC right when the workers needed a militant alternative.
Absolutely.
And then the reality of May 3, 1926 shatters all of that bureaucratic complacency in London and Moscow.
Yeah.
Despite the complete lack of revolutionary leadership at the top, despite the TUC dragging its feet, the sheer physical magnitude of the strike is awe-inspiring.
It really is.
When the call goes out, 4 million workers walk out. That's in addition to the 1 million miners who were already locked out of the pits by the owners. 5 million workers in 1926 Britain.
A massive portion of the population.
This isn't just a loud protest march. It is a total, grinding, terrifying halt to the economic heart of the country. All transport ceases. The sprawling railway networks sit totally idle. The buses don't move. The printing presses, as we discussed with the Daily Mail, are completely dead, meaning the government can't easily distribute its propaganda.
Right.
The steel mills go cold. Heavy chemicals, the massive building trades, the electricity networks, the gas supplies, everything is shut down by the organized, disciplined withdrawal of working-class labor. And here is where it gets truly fascinating.
Yeah. The local organization.
Exactly. In the vacuum created by the withdrawal of the capitalist state's normal daily functioning, you see the spontaneous organic emergence of embryonic organs of dual power.
Dual power.
The workers don't just stay home and sit on their hands. They actively organize the logistics of survival. Councils of action spring up all over the country. Look at the Clydeside strikers in Scotland. They don't just stop the transport. They actively take it over.
Running it themselves.
Right. They set up and run a complex 24-hour transport and courier system utilizing motorcycles and bicycles. They coordinate the strike across the entire region, deciding what essential supplies move like milk for children or supplies for hospitals and what doesn't.
That is actual functional workers' control?
It is. Or look at the East 5 Council of Action. They don't just set up peaceful picket lines. They actively field a 700-member workers' militia marching in formation to defend their communities from state violence and intimidation. The workers, out of sheer practical necessity, are instinctively beginning to administer society on their own terms.
And the state response to this spontaneous organization is terrifying, because the British ruling class, unlike the labor leaders, understands exactly what dual power means.
Oh, they know it's a mortal threat.
They recognize it instantly. They recall heavy battleships from the Atlantic Fleet and physically anchor them in the Mersey to threaten the northern industrial cities.
Battleships.
Battleships against their own citizens. They run armored convoys guarded by regular soldiers through the streets of London to break the transport blockades. In Hull, a light cruiser docks in the harbor, and the captain sends 50 men, armed with military rifles and fixed bayonets, marching down the gangplank to face down a crowd of unarmed, simming strikers.
That's horrifying.
Local police forces execute brutal, unprovoked baton charges to physically break up picket lines and terrorize working-class neighborhoods. It is a capitalist state rapidly mobilizing for outright civil war. But contrast the incredible life-and-death militancy of those workers in East Fife and Clydeside with the men sitting in the leadership offices of the TUC in London.
The fine fellows.
Fine fellows. Men like J.H. Thomas, Purcell, Swales, and Hicks. They are looking out their windows, and they are absolutely terrified of the massive, mobilized working class they are theoretically supposed to be leading. As the councils of action grow stronger and more confident, the TUC leadership desperately scours the political landscape for any avenue, any excuse to surrender and end the strike before it escapes their control completely.
And the profound tragedy here is not just that the TUC leadership was terrified of revolution. It's that the Communist Party, acting strictly under Stalin's explicit diplomatic orders, became the active mechanism for enforcing the TUC's surrender.
Yes.
The National Minority Movement, which was a massive rank-and-file organization heavily influenced by the Communists, actively instructed the militant, spontaneous local councils of action to strictly obey the conservative TUC General Council. Whenever a council of action wanted to escalate, the Communists told them to stand down and wait for orders from London.
They suppressed their own base.
They actively suppressed the independent initiative of the workers in order to maintain the diplomatic alliance with the reformist leaders. The CPTB was so ideologically committed to proving its loyalty and respectability to the TUC that it went to absurd lengths. I mean, they even complied with demands from right-wing union executives to end strike meetings by instructing the workers to sing "God Save the King" instead of the traditional socialist anthem, the Red Flag.
It's just sickening.
They were politically disarming the working class, blinding them to the nature of their leadership at the very moment the capitalist state was pointing fixed bayonets at their chests.
And that political disarmament inevitably, mathematically leads to capitulation.
Total capitulation. On May 12, just 9 days into this massive, unprecedented display of working-class power, the leadership of the PUC leaves their offices, travels to Downing Street, and visits Prime Minister Baldwin. They officially call off the general strike.
Unconditionally.
And they do it with absolutely zero guarantees against the victimization of the strikers. They get nothing. They secure no protections for the railwaymen who will be fired, no protections for the printers. They simply fold their hands and surrender unconditionally. The conservative politician Lord Birkenhead, who was present during these negotiations, commented on the sheer trembling cowardice of the union leaders during that surrender. He remarked with aristocratic disdain that their capitulation was so humiliating that some instinctive breeding made one unwilling to even look at them.
Wow. When even the ruling class pities your cowardice.
Right. And the betrayal is so raw, so palpable, and so immediate that the working class instantly recognizes what has happened. The anger in the industrial centers is explosive. When the official order from the TUC to return to work goes out via radio and newspaper, the strike actually grows.
More people walk out.
Yeah, 100,000 workers who hadn't even been on strike during the first 9 days actually walk out after the strike is officially called off. They do it in pure, unadulterated fury at the betrayal by their own leaders. But without a national leadership, without the coordination of a revolutionary party that had prepared them for this moment, the mass movement fragments. The energy dissipates.
Leaving the miners out to dry.
The miners, the very people this entire massive strike was initially organized to protect, are left completely isolated. They fight on alone. For months, they hold the line, subjected to brutal, grinding poverty. They watch their children go hungry until they are literally starved into physical submission and forced back down into the pits on the owner's dictatorial terms.
Just a devastating defeat. And, following this catastrophic, historic defeat, we must closely examine the fallout and the revealing role of the so-called Russian gold.
Right, the donations.
Because the utter catastrophic failure of Stalin's Anglo-Russian Committee was laid bare for the entire world to see. During the 9 days of the strike, the Soviet workers, demonstrating an immense, deeply moving sense of international solidarity, had collectively raised over £1 million from their own meager wages to support the British strikers.
Which was a fortune back then.
A massive sum. Yet, the TUC leadership, terrified of being associated with anything resembling communism during their desperate scramble to surrender to Baldwin, actively refused to accept the money. They publicly referred to the donations of the Soviet workers as this damned Russian gold.
Spit right in their faces.
They spat on the solidarity of the Soviet working class right before they signed the document of their own betrayal. And how did Stalin and the Comintern apparatus react to this glaring, undeniable exposure of his fine fellows? Did he acknowledge the error? Did he immediately break the alliance?
I'm guessing no.
No. He vehemently refused to break with the TUC. When Trotsky and the left opposition demanded an immediate public break with these betrayers, arguing that maintaining the alliance legitimized the architects of the defeat, Stalin denounced Trotsky as an ultra-leftist. Stalin insisted on maintaining the Anglo-Russian Committee, providing a crucial left-wing diplomatic cover for the very bureaucrats who had just sold out the British working class.
Unbelievable.
Trotsky delivered the final, devastating epitaph on this entire disastrous policy. He wrote, "Thanks to a radically false conception of the party, the greatest movement of the English proletariat not only did not shake the apparatus of the reactionary bureaucracy, but on the contrary, reinforced it and compromised communism in Great Britain for a long time.
Yeah.
That was the cost. The false conception of the party, the inherently flawed idea that a revolutionary organization could play second fiddle to reformists for diplomatic convenience, resulted in a historic defeat that fortified the right-wing leadership, demoralized the rank and file, and deeply alienated the most militant, self-sacrificing workers from the communist movement for a generation.
And here is the ultimate universal takeaway we have to extract from this disaster in Britain. It's a terrifying lesson about institutional survival. A massive, entrenched bureaucracy, like the leadership of the TUC, will always, instinctively, fear its own militant base far more than it fears the opposition of the state.
Exactly.
The TUC didn't surrender to Baldwin because they were beaten by the state's forces. They surrendered because they were terrified of what winning would actually mean. If the general strike succeeded, the councils of action would be running the country, the workers would be in charge, and the comfortable, well-paid bureaucratic mediators would be out of a job. So they sabotaged their own army.
A conscious betrayal.
And we have to understand that this disaster was not a localized accident. It was not a mere tactical error made by men on the ground. The exact same theoretical mechanism, the deliberate, conscious subordination of the working class to alien class forces in exchange for the illusion of Soviet diplomatic security, was simultaneously being applied by the Comintern on the other side of the world. So Stalin's strategy of playing nice with the acceptable leaders ends in total disaster in London. But the bureaucracy in Moscow doesn't view this as a wake-up call. They view it as a blueprint. And they immediately export this exact same strategy of tailing the acceptable leaders to a powder keg that is about to explode in the East, China.
The geographical theater now shifts to the Chinese Revolution of 1925 to 1927. The culture, the economy, and the immediate actors are entirely different. But the underlying theoretical struggle within the international communist movement, the struggle between Stalin's bureaucratic nationalist pragmatism and Trotsky's perspective of permanent international revolution, remains exactly the same.
But the body count is going to be so much higher.
The stakes are about to be raised to a horrific, incomprehensibly bloody level.
Let's set the physical and political stage in China in the 1920s. We are looking at a massive, ancient, but deeply fractured semi-colonial state. It is a country that has been carved up like a melon by foreign imperialist powers. Britain, France, Japan, the United States.
It's just extracting whatever they want.
Right. These empires control the vital deep-water ports, the lucrative trade routes, and the massive financial centers. And they do this through special concessions. These are essentially walled-off European cities built right on the Chinese coast, like in Shanghai, where foreign law rules, foreign police patrol, and Chinese sovereignty simply does not exist. It's a daily, visible humiliation.
And internally.
Internally, outside of these shiny coastal concessions, the vast Chinese landmass is torn apart by regional warlords. These are essentially glorified bandits commanding massive private armies, fighting endless territorial wars, and taxing the peasantry so brutally that in some provinces, taxes are collected 30 years in advance. The peasantry is literally starving. It is a society defined by extreme, unrelenting exploitation.
But things are changing in the cities.
Rapidly. Within this fractured, suffering landscape, something entirely new, modern, and powerful is rapidly emerging in the cities, and that's the Chinese industrial working class. The spark in the East ignites rapidly in May of 1925. The immediate catalyst is an act of brutal colonial arrogance.
The May 30th movement?
Yeah. A Japanese factory foreman in Shanghai murders a Chinese worker who was participating in a strike. This single act triggers mass, uncontrollable outrage. On May 30, a massive anti-imperialist protest marches through the streets of Shanghai. They are confronted by British-commanded municipal police who open fire directly into the unarmed crowd, massacring 12 protesters. This becomes known instantly as the May 30th movement, and the shockwaves are immediate and profound.
It sweeps the country.
Less than a month later, on June 23, British and French troops use heavy machine guns against a massive protest march in Canton, slaughtering over 50 people. The response of the Chinese working class to these massacres is spectacular. In Hong Kong, a massive, highly organized 100,000-strong general strike erupts. It is so effective that it paralyzes the entire British Crown colony, shutting down the port and the economy for over a year.
A year-long general strike.
Incredible, right? And leading this surging, incredibly militant tide of mass resistance is the newly formed Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. Founded just a few years earlier, its growth is explosive, meteoric. By the end of 1925, the CCP is organizing and representing over 570,000 industrial workers. They are rapidly becoming the decisive mass force in the urban centers.
It was a profoundly revolutionary situation, maturing with incredible speed. But Stalin intervened in this dynamic situation by reaching back into the archives and resurrecting a long-dead, thoroughly discredited theoretical framework, the Menshevik two-stage theory.
Oh boy.
We must clearly understand the mechanical logic of this theory to understand the disaster that followed. The two-stage theory argued that a society must follow a strict, predetermined historical schedule. First, it must pass through a stage of capitalist development to build up industry and material wealth. Only later, after capitalism has fully matured, can the society pass into a second stage, the socialist revolution.
Wait, isn't that exactly what Lenin fought against in 1917?
Yes. That was the exact identical theory that Lenin had to aggressively fight and defeat in April 1917 to convince the Bolsheviks to seize power in Russia. Stalin now applied this defeated theory directly to China. He argued that because China was a semi-colonial country burdened with strong feudal remnants and warlords, its revolution could only be a bourgeois democratic one in the current immediate stage.
So capitalism first.
Right. The goal was merely national independence and a capitalist republic. Therefore, Stalin decreed, the revolution must naturally be led by the Chinese national bourgeoisie, the native capitalists. In China, the political and military representative of this national bourgeoisie was the Kuomintang, or KMT.
Okay, so the KMT is supposed to lead.
To formally justify handing leadership to the KMT, Stalin formulated a concept he called the block of four classes. He argued that the overriding pressure of foreign imperialist oppression had temporarily erased class lines, unifying the diverse classes of China, the proletariat, the peasantry, the urban petty bourgeoisie, and the national capitalist bourgeoisie into a single harmonious bloc with shared national interests.
A harmonious bloc.
Consequently, the Comintern in Moscow issued a fatal non-negotiable order. The Chinese Communist Party must join the KMT and act as its loyal, disciplined subordinates. The CCP was strictly forbidden from forming independent workers' soviets or challenging capitalist property relations in any way, because doing so would supposedly frighten the national bourgeoisie, break the delicate bloc, and ruin the first stage of the revolution.
I really need to unpack that block of four classes concept because from a Marxist perspective, it sounds like a complete contradiction in terms. Stalin essentially forced the Chinese Communist Party into a massive corporate merger where they were the legally bound junior partner.
That's a good way to put it.
He told the communists, representing the workers who want better wages and eventually socialism, to merge with the KMT, representing the factory owners who want to keep wages low and protect their property. And he legally forbade the junior partner from competing with or challenging the KMT's agenda, even though their long-term fundamental class interests were diametrically violently opposed.
Inherently opposed.
But let me ask you this, playing devil's advocate again. The KMT, at this time led by General Chiang Kai-shek, actually possessed a massive army. They were actively fighting the northern warlords. They were publicly denouncing the foreign imperialists. If you are the CCP fighting those exact same imperialist enemies, why shouldn't you form a united military front with Chiang Kai-shek? Doesn't a military alliance against a common enemy make basic, undeniable strategic sense on a battlefield?
There is a monumental life and death difference between a temporary tactical military alliance against a common enemy on a specific battlefield and the total liquidation of a revolutionary party's political independence.
Okay, unpack that.
Trotsky and the left opposition never argued against striking military blows together with the KMT against the warlords or the British imperialists. If you are both shooting at the same warlord, you coordinate your fire. His argument was that while striking together, the CCP must retain its absolute political autonomy.
They need their own identity.
Yes. It must maintain its own organizational structure, its own independent press to speak to the workers, its own distinct banners, and its own uncompromising program of class struggle. Trotsky warned that the workers and the vast peasantry had to be politically prepared for the inevitable mathematical moment when the Chinese bourgeoisie, terrified by the rising power of the masses, would turn their guns against the workers to protect their property.
They always do.
But Stalin did not just orchestrate a temporary military alliance with the KMT. He completely submerged the CCP within it. He forced the communists to surrender their political identity, and he went even further. In March 1926, the Comintern in Moscow took the astonishing, unprecedented step of officially admitting the bourgeois Kuomintang into the Communist International as a sympathizing section.
You're kidding.
They literally gave Chiang Kai-shek, a bourgeois militarist, the title of honorary chairman within the World Communist Movement. By doing this, the Comintern actively fostered the fatal illusion among the Chinese masses that Chiang Kai-shek was a reliable revolutionary savior rather than their inevitable future executioner.
And the warning signs that Chiang Kai-shek was anything but a savior were flashing bright red almost immediately. But those warnings were completely, deliberately ignored by Moscow. Look at exactly what happens on March 20, 1926. Chiang stages a sudden, vicious military coup in the southern city of Canton.
It's not just a test run.
It's a preliminary test of strength. He violently detains leading communist organizers. He places the Soviet military advisors who were there to help him under armed house arrest. He asserts total dictatorial military control over the entire KMT apparatus and initiates a brutal crackdown on the independent labor unions that the communists had built. It is a blatant, aggressive, undeniable military move against the left wing of the movement.
And Stalin's reaction.
How does Stalin react to his honorary chairman arresting his communists? He actively covers it up. News of the Canton coup is completely suppressed in the Soviet press. Not a word reaches the Soviet workers. Stalin's faction internally dismisses the reports as mere imperialist propaganda designed to divide the Revolutionary Alliance. They desperately, pathologically protect the fiction of the bloc of four classes in order to maintain their diplomatic relationship with Chiang Kai-shek.
And while Stalin deliberately covered up the reality of the Canton coup, Trotsky recognized its profound, terrifying significance. He did not see it as an isolated incident. He saw it as the preliminary tremor of a massive impending earthquake.
He knew what was coming.
In September 1926, Trotsky issued a stark, desperate warning to the Comintern. He analyzed the underlying social dynamics, stating that the immense, irreconcilable pressure of the class struggle would inevitably tear the Kuomintang apart. He argued that as the workers demanded more rights, the bourgeoisie would inevitably seek a military dictatorship to crush the workers before the workers could challenge capitalist property.
Makes perfect theoretical sense.
Trotsky demanded that the CCP immediately withdraw from the KMT, secure its complete political and organizational independence, and begin the urgent work of building independent workers and peasant Soviets to prepare for the coming, inevitable civil war. His prescient warnings were ruthlessly suppressed by the bureaucracy and denounced as pessimistic defeatism.
Of course. And despite Moscow's suppression of Trotsky's warnings, the objective, unstoppable reality of the revolution continued to accelerate on the ground, moving rapidly toward a massive, violent climax. We see this immense social pressure play out vividly during what is known as the Northern Expedition.
Right, the military campaign.
This was the KMT's massive, coordinated military campaign launched from their base in the south, aimed at marching north to militarily conquer the warlords and unify the fractured country. But as Chiang's massive armies moved north, a mass social revolution simply exploded in their wake. The military advance of the KMT acted as a powerful psychological catalyst for the deeply oppressed masses.
They felt empowered.
In Hunan province alone, an estimated 4 million farmers flooded into newly formed radical peasant associations. And they didn't just politely ask the landlords for lower rents. They began physically driving out the predatory landlords, seizing the deeds, and taking the land for themselves.
Actual revolution.
In the industrial cities, the working class mobilized with breathtaking, terrifying speed. Over 500,000 workers flooded into the communist-led General Labor Union. In the city of Hankou, the mobilized workers spontaneously, without waiting for orders, stormed and seized the British colonial concessions, forcing the heavily armed imperialists to humiliatingly retreat to their gunboats.
Just incredible mass action.
The masses were taking power into their own hands, completely bypassing the neat, theoretical two stages Stalin had designed for them. And this unstoppable wave of mass action brings us to the crucial month of March 1927. The Northern Expedition reaches the outskirts of Shanghai, the absolute industrial and financial heart of China.
The prize.
In coordination with the approaching KMT army, the Communist Party leadership inside the city calls a general strike. 800,000 workers lay down their tools. They organize armed workers' militias. They launch a full-scale urban insurrection, completely crush the formidable forces of the local warlord in vicious street fighting, and take total, undisputed control of the entire sprawling city, with the sole exception of the heavily fortified foreign concessions where the Westerners hide.
They took the city.
The working class is essentially in power in Shanghai. They have militarily delivered the most important city in Asia to the KMT. And as Chiang Kai-shek's troops wait outside the city gates, what is the order that arrives from Moscow? Stalin sends a catastrophic suicidal directive. The CCP must not establish a workers' Soviet. They must not retain their weapons. They must literally bury their arms, stand down their victorious militias, open the gates, and welcome Chiang Kai-shek's advancing troops as their liberators.
And Stalin's explicit justification for this disarmament order reveals the profound, almost sociopathic cynicism of his bureaucratic policy. On April 5, 1927, just days before the impending disaster in Shanghai, Stalin gave a major speech to thousands of party cadres assembled in the Hall of Columns in Moscow.
What did he tell them?
He was directly addressing the growing anxious fears regarding Chiang Kai-shek's true intentions. Stalin confidently, arrogantly declared, Chiang Kai-shek is submitting to discipline. They have to be utilized to the end, squeezed out like a lemon, and then flung away.
Wow.
That was his calculation. He believed he could perfectly manipulate a bourgeois army from a desk in Moscow.
Because it turned out the lemon was holding a machine gun. So Chiang Kai-shek marches his armies into Shanghai, where the workers have effectively handed him the city. How does he repay them? I want you to visualize the visceral waking nightmare of what happens next. April 12, 1927. Chiang Kai-shek formally enters Shanghai. He has not been submitting to discipline. He has been secretly conferring for weeks with the wealthy Chinese merchants, the panicked foreign imperialists hiding in their concessions, and the ruthless leadership of the Green Gang.
The criminal syndicate.
Yeah, the massive, heavily armed criminal syndicate that completely controls the Shanghai underworld. They've struck a blood pact. Chiang answers the workers' general strike not with gratitude, but with organized, industrialized slaughter. Before dawn, he unleashes his regular military troops and thousands of Green Gang thugs, armed with Western weapons, against the sleeping, unarmed workers.
It's just a massacre.
They violently attack the headquarters of the General Labor Union. When the surviving workers attempt to organize a massive protest march the next day to demand the release of their comrades, Chiang's troops set up heavy machine guns at intersections and opened fire directly into the dense crowds of men, women, and children. Thousands of workers, students, and communist organizers are butchered in the streets of Shanghai in a matter of hours.
Devastating.
The executions continue relentlessly for days. Prominent union leaders are dragged into public squares and publicly beheaded with broadswords to terrorize the population. It is a massacre of horrifying, unimaginable proportions, a white terror that rapidly, systematically spreads to every single city and province under Chiang's military control. The vanguard of the Chinese working class, the bravest and most dedicated militants, is physically annihilated. And you have to wonder, how does Stalin react to this utter world historic devastation of the movement he was supposed to be leading? Does he admit he was wrong? Let me guess, he doesn't.
No. His apparatus doubles down on the lie. The official organ of the Soviet state, Pravda, publishes an astonishing statement declaring that the horrific events in Shanghai actually proved that the line laid down was the correct line.
You have got to be kidding me.
They bizarrely claim that Chiang's betrayal was completely anticipated and merely meant the revolution was successfully shedding its right wing and moving to a higher stage. It is a breathtaking, pathological denial of reality, constructed entirely to protect the infallible prestige of the Moscow bureaucracy.
It's sickening. Having been completely outmaneuvered, disarmed, and violently betrayed by the right wing of the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek, Stalin doesn't draw the necessary, fundamental Marxist conclusion that the Chinese bourgeoisie as a whole was inherently counter-revolutionary. Instead of correcting the theory, he simply executes a cynical bureaucratic pivot.
He shifts left.
Exactly. He orders the shattered, decimated remnants of the Chinese Communist Party to immediately transfer their total, uncritical allegiance to the so-called left Kuomintang. This left faction had established a rival civilian government in the inland industrial city of Wuhan under the leadership of a slick bourgeois politician named Wang Qingwei.
Right.
Stalin loudly proclaims to the world that Wang Qingwei and the left KMT represent the authentic revolutionary petty bourgeoisie, and that they would now faithfully lead the Chinese masses in the completion of the democratic revolution. To artificially solidify this new, desperate alliance, CCP leaders are actually instructed by Moscow to take up official ministerial posts within Wang's bourgeois government.
Tying themselves to the state again.
Men like Tan Pingshan and Su Chaozhen become ministers of agriculture and labor. But to maintain the political favor of Wang Qingwei, these communist ministers are forced into a grotesque position. They are forced to actively repress their own mass base. They're ordered to issue official government directives curbing the excessive land seizures of the militant peasant associations and shutting down the strikes of the radicalized workers. They have to suppress the revolution so as not to alienate the property-owning military allies of the left, KMT.
It is a staggering, mind-numbing repetition of the exact same fatal error that just destroyed them in Shanghai, just shifted slightly to the left on the bourgeois political spectrum.
Yeah.
They were doing the exact same thing again.
Which is just insanity.
And Trotsky predicted the gruesome outcome of this second pivot with absolute tragic scientific precision. At the 8th plenum of the Comintern Executive Committee in May 1927, while the CCP was actively subordinating itself to the Wuhan government, Trotsky issued a desperate final warning. He meticulously analyzed the class position and material interests of the left KMT leadership. He stated unequivocally, politicians of the Wang Qingwei type will unite 10 times with Chiang Kai-shek against the workers and peasants.
Wow.
That was the sociological reality. He explained that when faced with a mobilized armed working class that is beginning to threaten private property, the liberal petty bourgeoisie will always inevitably collapse in terror into the arms of the big bourgeoisie and the military dictatorship. Property unites them against the masses.
And Trotsky's prophecy is fulfilled with terrifying mathematical speed. Barely 2 months later, on July 15, 1927, the Wuhan betrayal occurs. Wang Qingwei, feeling the immense military pressure from Chiang Kai-shek's successes and absolutely terrified by the ongoing uncontrollable peasant revolts in the countryside surrounding his capital, decides to make his peace with the right wing.
He flips.
He flips. He officially purges all communists from the left, KMT, and expels them from his government. The alliance is abruptly severed, and a new, massive wave of mass executions immediately begins. The terror unleashed by the so-called left KMT is, in many rural regions, even more systematic and brutal than Chiang's initial purge in Shanghai.
Hard to even imagine.
The left KMT generals systematically hunt down the communist organizers in the countryside. The massive, million-strong peasant associations in Hunan, which had taken the land just months before, are systematically drowned in blood. It is conservatively estimated that 25,000 communists are slaughtered in just the first half of 1927 alone. This completely, utterly shatters the organizational backbone of the moral spirit of the party. The strategy of the bloc of four classes, the insistence on tailing the bourgeoisie, has resulted in the literal physical extermination of the revolutionary vanguard.
And faced with this unmitigated, undeniable catastrophe and desperately needing to fend off the devastating, entirely vindicated criticisms of the left opposition at the upcoming 15th Party Congress scheduled for December, Stalin executes a final, abrupt, wholly cynical left-about-face.
A panic move.
Totally. Having deliberately held the Chinese working class back during the actual period of mass revolutionary upsurge, having ordered them to bury their weapons when they held power in Shanghai, he now orders the shattered, bleeding, isolated remnants of the CCP to launch an immediate, localized, armed insurrection. This panicked directive leads to the desperate, tragic push known as the Canton Commune of December 1927.
I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a surviving Chinese communist cadre in December 1927. You have just spent the last 9 months watching tens of thousands of your closest comrades be slaughtered because Moscow explicitly told you to surrender your weapons and trust the bourgeoisie. You are hiding in the shadows. And now, those exact same voices in Moscow are ordering you to emerge and launch an armed uprising against a heavily fortified military garrison with no heavy weapons and with a local working class population that is utterly exhausted, terrified, and completely demoralized by the terror.
It's suicidal.
It is. But you obey. You do it just so Stalin can have a revolutionary victory to point to at a political conference in Russia. It is an adventure completely divorced from the actual mood of the masses. The communist cadres fought with immense heartbreaking heroism. They actually succeeded in seizing temporary control of Canton, but they were completely isolated. There was no rising mass movement across the province to support them. The Kuomintang military forces quickly surrounded the city, bombarded it, and crushed the commune in just 3 days, executing thousands more workers and cadres in the bloody aftermath.
Just a horrific end. But even in its tragic brevity, that 3-day existence of the Canton Commune definitively, practically answered the great theoretical debate that had raged in Moscow.
How so?
When the communists briefly held state power in Canton, what were they actually forced to do? They didn't just implement mild bourgeois democratic reforms like lowering rents or establishing a parliament. To merely survive the military siege, to physically feed the starving population and defend the barricades, they were immediately, practically compelled by the logic of the struggle to confiscate bourgeois property.
They had to go all the way.
They seized the private banks, they nationalized the large manufacturing industries, they took total control over the transportation networks, they struck directly at the heart of capitalism. Trotsky closely analyzed this empirical program of the Commune and posed a devastating, unanswerable question to the Stalinist bureaucracy. He asked, if these are the methods of a bourgeois revolution, then what should the proletarian revolution in China look like? That is the question. The brief, heroic existence of the Canton Commune proved, in the negative, the theory of permanent revolution. It proved definitively that the national bourgeoisie in a backward country was utterly incapable of leading a revolution or even solving basic democratic tasks. It proved that the working class, once thrust into power, could not artificially limit itself to a capitalist stage, but had to immediately begin implementing deep socialist measures just to survive. The profound, bitter tragedy of the 20th century is that this theoretical vindication of Trotsky's analysis was paid for with the lives of tens of thousands of Chinese workers and peasants.
Let us synthesize the immense, crushing historical weight of these two tragedies we've examined today. We have journeyed through the massive 9-day general strike in the industrial heart of Britain and the explosive, earth-shaking revolution in the semi-colonial expanse of China. In both cases, the working class demonstrated incredible, almost superhuman courage, organization, and a profound capacity for self-sacrifice. And in both cases, they suffered monumental historic defeats that altered the course of the century.
And we must emphasize this final point with absolute clarity. These massive defeats were not accidents of history. They were not the result of bad luck, poor weather, or the isolated miscalculations of individual organizers on the ground. They were the direct, logical, and structurally inevitable result of the theory of socialism in one country being applied as global strategy.
The theory killed them.
By officially abandoning the perspective of international world revolution in order to secure the immediate short-term diplomatic interests of the Soviet bureaucracy, Stalin fundamentally, permanently transformed the very nature of the Communist International. The Comintern ceased to be the general staff of the world revolution, dedicated to building independent, uncompromising revolutionary leaderships in every country. Instead, it was degraded into a mere instrument of Soviet foreign policy.
Just geopolitical pawns.
The various national communist parties around the globe were effectively reduced to what were essentially border guards for the USSR. They were forced to politically subordinate themselves to reformist union bosses in Britain or ruthless bourgeois nationalists in China, simply to secure favorable trade treaties or temporary diplomatic alliances for Moscow. The independent historical interests, and indeed the very lives of the international working class, were coldly sacrificed on the altar of bureaucratic stability.
And the cost of that sacrifice is almost impossible to fully quantify. I mean, it wasn't just the literal blood spilled in the streets of Shanghai or the slow, agonizing starvation of the striking miners of the Welsh valleys. It was the profound, lingering political disorientation that blanketed the global labor movement. These massive international defeats exposed the utter, deadly bankruptcy of Stalin's policies to anyone who was paying close attention. But perversely, and this is where the history turns incredibly dark, as Trotsky understood, these international defeats did not actually weaken Stalin's grip on power in Moscow. They fundamentally strengthened it.
Which seems counterintuitive, but it's true.
Right. And this brings us to the bridge for our next deep dive into this history. The international disasters deepened the isolation of the Soviet Union. The workers in Russia, who had sacrificed so much blood and endured so much starvation for the October Revolution, watched in horror as the revolution was crushed abroad. They were overwhelmed by a profound, paralyzing sense of demoralization and exhaustion. This pervasive atmosphere of political despair, the feeling that the global cavalry was never coming, is the exact specific climate the growing bureaucracy needed to permanently consolidate its dictatorial grip. Next time, when we dive back into these sources for Part 3, titled The Expulsion, we will trace the final, desperate, heroic struggle of the left opposition against this bureaucratic consolidation. We will examine the formation of the United Opposition, the dramatic shouting showdown at the 15th Party Congress in December 1927, and the terrible moment when Leon Trotsky is physically dragged from his home by the secret police and sent to an internal exile at Alma-Ata.
And before we go, I want to leave you with a chilling, deeply unsettling realization as we conclude this analysis. Consider deeply how the psychological shock of these massive, entirely avoidable international defeats fundamentally, permanently altered the internal psychological life of the Soviet Union itself. The blood spilled by the machine guns in the streets of Shanghai and the agonizing, slow starvation of the British miners didn't merely break the back of the revolution abroad. Those defeats reverberated back into Russia like a poison. They severed the vital, life-giving nerve of international solidarity that had sustained the Russian workers through the darkest days of their own civil war. They proved to the exhausted Soviet masses that help was not coming, that they were entirely alone in a hostile world. This induced the exact atmosphere of deep cynicism, political apathy, and profound, hopeless exhaustion required for the Stalinist bureaucracy to finally crush all internal dissent. The defeats in Britain and China were the necessary psychological prerequisites that prepared the ground, ensuring that the Soviet working class would be too atomized, too broken, and too despairing to resist when Stalin eventually turned his apparatus inward and launched the Great Terror at home.